All right, thanks, Daniela. Do I need the microphone or can you hear me okay in the back? Great. So it's really nice to be here at OPR today. Thank you for such a nice introduction. As Daniela was describing my research, you'll see that I'm not presenting any of that really. This is a new project that I've been working on with my colleague, Catherine Curtis at the University of Wisconsin. So Catherine is a spatial and environmental demographer. I have been working on sort of fertility in Malawi for a very long time. And so we kind of brought our interests together and sort of doing, this is part of a larger mixed methods project on sort of how rainfall, and particularly rainfall uncertainty, might be affecting fertility change within Malawi. So I'm going to primarily be focusing on our quantitative analysis, but this summer I collected 66 qualitative interviews. So if there's time, I'm hoping to bring in some of the qualitative results at the end as well. So most of what we know about rainfall and fertility, really, it's a little bit, well, actually, I should say there's a really bifurcated literature on rainfall and fertility. There's a very large literature from the 70s, 80s, early 90s that was really focused on rainfall and natural fertility populations. So thinking about how rainfall might be tied into the agricultural cycles, how that relates to the intensity of work, how that relates to food availability, the potential for labor migration, and how this would indirectly and unintentionally affect fertility outcomes. So you would see a tie in a natural fertility population that was very agriculturally based, of a seasonality, a monthly variation based upon the agricultural cycles, and that also droughts would have a large impact on fertility in these cases. This was largely sort of thinking about through how the impacts of nutrition and workload intensity on things like fecundability, the risk of fetal loss, but then also some of it focused on the role that labor migration had in unintentionally reducing fertility as well. The second half of this literature is very, very new. So for a long time, people have conducted a lot of research on rainfall and migration. But really, I think in most of the literature on livelihoods adaptations to weather shocks, fertility was really an afterthought on that process. So very little was actually done exploring within sort of weather shocks about how rainfall might be leading to intentional fertility changes. We can draw a little bit from some of the more sort of environment and fertility literature on things like deforestation and sort of environmental resources, but up until very, very recently, people haven't been looking at rainfall, primarily because there wasn't really good rainfall measures that we could really link to our reproductive health surveys. This has really changed pretty radically within the last 5 years. There's been sort of this explosion of the availability of various sort of international weather measures, primarily things like the satellite-based rainfall measures, satellite-based natural vegetation cover, bigger sort of measures of sort of international temperature changes, and people have been linking this then to fertility data in the last couple of years. So when Catherine and I sat down to think about this project, we really, I guess we sort of cooked it up over dinner one night in 2016 when I had just come back from a period of field work, and none of these papers had been published when we first started thinking about this topic. So most of the work that's happening is really new, and it's kind of coming really hot off the presses. I think of Allum Portner's paper that came out last year in World Development as really a nice transition from this natural fertility literature. So they took the 1992 Tanzania DHS and linked it to data on crop losses. And they found that in a country that hadn't really begun the fertility transition, they found that in the periods after a period of a large crop loss, there was a big boost in traditional contraception. So not much change in modern contraceptive use because there was really little modern contraceptive use in Tanzania at that time, but you saw an increase in withdrawal usage. You saw an increase in people reporting periodic abstinence in response to crop losses that were primarily related to droughts and weather changes. Herskowitz has kind of scaled it up on a really big way. She took 29 demographic and health surveys from sub-Saharan Africa and linked them to rainfall measures and looking primarily at the impact of drought on fertility. And she finds that in the year after a drought, birth rates fell by about 1% to 2% across that pool of African countries. So a modest change, but a significant change that was there. And this gets really well complemented, I think, by Simon's work in Mexico, where he finds that in when you had not necessarily droughts, but when you had above average rainfalls, and particularly above average rainfalls in traditionally dry areas, you actually had a fertility boost in those areas. So whereas a lot of the literature in Africa is focused on sort of negative climate shocks and sort of how sort of this negative impact of droughts on fertility, he's really sort of thinking about how having a boom year essentially led people to sort of accelerate their childbearing relative to regular rainfall times. That's not to say that this literature is all kind of finding sort of one single narrative. So a couple of the more recent papers that have come out in the last couple of months find actually sort of negative, sort of the opposite findings really, so that Desi and colleagues are looking at Madagascar at the impact of droughts, and they actually find that in the year after a drought, women's fertility actually rises. They make the argument that when there's a drought, there's lower demand for women's agricultural labor, which reduces the opportunity cost of childbearing, and so people are sort of using childbearing to fill those spaces. Sellers and Gray are taking a slightly different tack on things. They're using data from Indonesia and thinking about delays in the onset of the monsoon rains in Indonesia. And so a delayed onset of the rains means a shortening of the growing season and is a negative shock. And they find that fertility goes up as the monsoon rains are delayed. And that they sort of go back into older arguments of invoking Meade Kane and thinking about how people might be leaning to children as an insurance to hedge against future economic hardships. Right, so I think the key takeaway, there's not really a single conclusive answer. The data from sub-Saharan Africa, or at least from continental sub-Saharan Africa, seems to point towards a drought effect that's there. And also seems like the measurement approach really makes a difference of how you're thinking about measuring rainfall, whether it's aggregate total rainfall versus intensity measures of rainfall versus the timing of rains. And so this is sort of new and sort of interesting, but it's not really the question that Catherine and I got interested in. When I was coming back from the field in 2016, I was telling her a story about how things had just gotten really wildly fluctuating from year to year. So it seemed like Malawi was fluctuating from periods of really severe drought and really widespread food insecurity, and then the very next year you would have catastrophic flooding and swinging sort of back and forth with these sort of wild weather patterns. And so we were interested in sort of what role uncertainty might be playing in all this. So thinking about a weather shock is one thing, but whether living in this context of constantly fluctuating rainfall that leads you to not really have a good sense of predicting what might be coming next, whether that might have its own independent effect on fertility outcomes. And from this, we have a larger literature on uncertainty that we can draw from. Most of it has really focused on economic uncertainty, primarily looking in Europe at the role that recessions have played, thinking about how changes in unemployment, changes in other measures of economic well-being have had an impact on fertility, largely for the effect of postponing births, so that individuals in hard times will wait and sort of save those births for the future. I think Rajan gives a really nice sort of theoretical model for this, sort of how, in the idea that once you have a birth, that's an irreversible decision. But if you can constantly revise the choice to postpone that next birth. And so if times seem hard or uncertain in the present, but there's still some hope that the future will be better, then it makes sense to postpone those births into that next period. And you can constantly keep revising that choice until times get better or they're judged as such. And that even though most of this literature is really coming from Europe, there's been some work in Latin America, and particularly sort of Parfait Landau and Yege's work in Cameroon around the economic crisis. They are showing that fertility went down, particularly insensitive to the economic crisis that was happening in the early 90s. This all also fits within the literature on postponement in sub-Saharan Africa. So I think there's a general sense that the African fertility transition is different, is following a very different path than other parts of the world have followed. We normally talk around fertility transitions and fertility decline in terms of stopping behavior, so families reaching the desired number of children and then sort of ending their childbearing, or in terms of spacing behavior, where it's based upon sort of how old your youngest child is and trying to sort of set out a desired amount of birth spacing that's there. And what Timaeus and Moultrie have really been pushing is that actually we can really think about what's happening in sub-Saharan Africa as a postponement postponement transition that's somewhat different from what we've seen in Europe. So it's not a postponement of first births the way that we've seen in most of the low fertility countries, but a lengthening of all of the birth intervals to extents that are really not directly tied to the last birth. So thinking about birth intervals that are on the order of 5, 6, 7 years long between births that are there, and that this stretching out of birth intervals over time sort of leads to kind of a proportionate decline in fertility at all ages. So in many African countries, if you think about the age pattern of fertility, rather than kind of either having a sort of a shortening of it or getting more condensed, you actually find it just gets flatter as time is passing in most countries. And so a lot of these arguments around postponement are sort of embracing this flexibility of fertility timing in response to uncertain conditions. So as things are sort of allowing people to sort of be cognizant of how things are in flux around them. And sort of this postponement literature combined with the economic shock literature would really lead us to expect that individuals who are facing greater weather uncertainty might be lowering their fertility relative to places that have less uncertainty. The one little caveat to this is the actual literature on uncertainty in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in Malawi. So Jenny Trinitopoli and Sarah Yateman have a field site about 25 kilometers down the road from my field site in Malawi, and they, in their survey, they had a paper that came out in 2012 thinking about HIV-related uncertainty and fertility choices. So they were gauging whether or not women were certain that they were HIV positive, certain that they were HIV negative, or uncertain about their current HIV status. And they found that women who were uncertain about their status had significantly higher fertility rates than women who were certain that they were either positive or negative. This idea sort of in the reverse of Ranjan, this idea that perhaps I'm healthy now, but there's this negative fatalistic possibility that things will be worse off in the next time period. And so therefore it's sort of a now or never embracing of fertility. Sarah Garver also has a really interesting series of papers that have been coming out of her dissertation. She was a John Casterline student at the Ohio State University. And so she was working in a different part of Malawi and developed what she calls an index of livelihoods uncertainty. So she asked respondents a series of questions about the extent to which they plan for the future. If they faced a crisis, how prepared would they be to marshal the resources to respond to that crisis? How involved are they in budgeting? How much are they planning for the future? And she sort of finds in her livelihoods uncertainty, this abstract measure, that people who are overall more uncertain have higher fertility than individuals who scored lower on this uncertainty. So there is sort of some reason to think that possibly uncertainty could be working in the opposite direction. All right, so this leads us to our research questions. So first, just thinking about how some of this more traditional new literature on rainfall and fertility is playing out. So how do those interannual fluctuations, so is fertility different in a drought, following a drought year relative to following a really good rainfall year? And then what we're slightly more interested in is what role is rainfall uncertainty playing in fertility outcomes in Malawi? So I've been working in Malawi since 2006, so it was sort of a natural place for me to be grounding my research questions, but it turns out that it's actually an incredibly useful place to be thinking about rainfall. We've been working with a hydrologist at the University of Malawi for some of our work that we have in plans for, and he points out that Malawi actually has one of the most erratic rainfall patterns in all of sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a slightly landlocked country. I should have had a better map. So if South Africa is at the bottom of the continent, Mozambique is kind of shaped like my hand going up the coast to the Indian Ocean, and Malawi is a long, skinny country kind of sitting in the thumb of Mozambique. So it's landlocked, but it still is very strongly influenced by the southern oscillations of the El Nino cycles coming off the Indian Ocean. And it's actually sandwiched between two climate zones that are both influenced by sea temperatures on the Indian Ocean. So depending upon how these two climate zones are fluctuating relative to each other, that's what's leading to really large year-to-year fluctuations in rainfall. And you can see sort of from the map over there as well, this is the distribution of total rainfall in 2014. And you can see that for a small country, there's actually a really large amount of within-country heterogeneity in rainfall totals, largely due to sort of These places along the lake having sort of lakeshore influenced rainfall patterns, some really large topographical changes down here in southern Malawi. And so you actually have a lot of internal variation in rainfall patterns and in rainfall uncertainty. This all also plays out because Malawi is still considered to be one of the 15 poorest countries in the world. About 70% of people in the country are dependent upon subsistence agriculture. Someone at dinner was pointing out that 80% of all exports in the country are still agricultural. So rain matters a lot for economic well-being at the household level and at the national level. And against this backdrop, Malawi stands out as having a really recent and really rapid fertility decline. So from 1990 to 2010, births only fell by 1, the TFR only fell by 1, from 6.7 to 5.7. From 2010 to 2015, they fell to 4.4, and then the 2018 census estimates that TFR is currently around 4.17 births per woman in Malawi. So it's changing really fast, really recently, much faster than what we saw in the past. And just to give a little bit more context about what the rainy season looks like, Malawi has a very clear, pronounced rainy season. So the rains typically start around November. They peak December or January, normally start tapering off by April. And then for May through October, rainfall is really negligible. Like, it's very, very unusual to have any rainfall for those months in between the rainy season. The gray line there is showing the long-term trends in rainfall for Malawi, but the black line is giving us what happened in 2015, just as an example. So 2015 was a big drought year. And so you can really see that dropping off the rainy season, ending prematurely relative to that historical average. 2015 is the most recent year for which the Malawian Weather Service has been releasing its information. So it gives you some sense about how things are sort of changing, at least in the recent years, and what's going on. So to get at the quantitative part of our question, we're using the data that IPPMS has done by taking the demographic and health survey. So these nationally representative surveys of reproductive age women, and they've combined them together with CHIRP's rainfall data. So it's a satellite-based rainfall measure that's linked to the DHS at the cluster level. So the DHS in their restricted data have geocoded all of the clusters, and we can think about how so they're able to give us the rainfall measures going back in time. The CHIRPs will actually link all the way back, I think, to like 1990 in rainfall measures that we have. The DHS, to protect the anonymity of its respondents, does a random displacement of clusters within a 10-kilometer radius of the original cluster site. So there's a little bit of noise in terms of that the rainfall measure is within 10 kilometers of the actual center of the cluster that's there. And that the other thing that we're doing here is thinking about how if we want to link reproductive choices and outcomes to rainfall, we want to make sure that we're capturing the women who are actually living in these clusters. So we've restricted our analysis to women who lived in the survey cluster for at least 3 years so that we know that the fertility that they're experiencing is tied and happening in the cluster for which the rainfall is being measured. Our first outcome we're looking at is births per person period. We're using Bruno Schumacher's method of taking the retrospective birth history and slicing it into person periods. Normally we would take it as a 1-year period starting October to September as our year interval that we have. And then if someone has a birthday in the middle of a year that moves them from one 5-year age group into the next 5-year age group, we split that person period. So if someone has a birthday in August, then up until August, their birthday makes them turn from 24 to 25. The first part of the year through August, they can be considered to be 20 to 24, and then from sort of September onwards, they would be coded as 25 to 29. So splitting it into these 1 year or smaller than 1 year person periods and looking at whether a birth occurs within each of those person periods gives us over 273,000 person periods for analysis, and we're looking at that within a total of 2,000, over sort of 2,700 clusters across those 4 survey rounds of the DHS. We're also using the contraceptive calendar to be thinking about monthly modern contraceptive use. And so here we have about 1.3 million person months of contraceptive use that we can be looking at across a smaller number of clusters because the contraceptive calendar wasn't collected in the 2000 survey. So we only have the 3 most recent surveys to be looking at. When we think about rainfall, which is sort of our more traditional measure of thinking about drought, we're taking the annual rainfall total for a cluster and thinking about it, converting it to a z-score relative to the longer term trend for that cluster. In this case, so thinking about particularly drought as being classified as anything more than 1 standard deviation below the average, any higher as being 1 standard deviation above the average. And then our measure of rainfall uncertainty, we take the 5 years prior to the survey, and we take the average rainfall in that 5-year prior period to that person period. And so that way, so we're just taking purely the standard deviation in rainfall in the 5 years previous. I know taking a standard deviation on 5 observations is really noisy, but the noisiness is the point, right? We're trying to get a measure of how big are those swings from year to year. So it gives us a way to think about a place that has low rainfall uncertainty will be a place where there's relatively little year-to-year fluctuation in the previous 5 years. A place with really high rainfall uncertainty would be the places with the 25% highest year-to-year fluctuation. So using that interquartile range to identify the lowest 25% and the highest 25% of rainfall uncertainty. So when we think about, just getting a sense about this is giving us the prevalence of drought, given the prevalence of clusters that are marked as experiencing drought, in this case from 1996 to the most recent observation we have in the survey. So you can see that there are sort of these sort of ebbs and flows as time is passing in drought. The orange is giving us the regular drought between 1 and 1.5 standard deviations below average, and the blue is giving us a measure of extreme drought that's more than 1.5 standard deviations from the average in a cluster. And then this is our measure of the prevalence of above average rainfall. So again, the orange is giving us places that are 1 to 1.5 standard deviations above the long-term average. The blue is giving us sort of extremely high rainfall that's more than 1.5 standard deviations above the average for that cluster. And the part that we're most interested in is this measure of rainfall uncertainty. So again, so our high uncertainty is places in the 25% largest sort of year-to-year fluctuations, and those are showing up here as these dark dots. Each of these dots represents a cluster in the DHS, so these are for the 5 survey rounds that we're using. And you can see, for example, here back in 2000, there was a lot of high interannual variation, this high rainfall uncertainty in southern Malawi. The orange dots are showing low uncertainty. So in the central part of the country, there was low. And actually in the northern part, they were in that 50% of the middle, 50% of the distribution of the magnitude of those year-to-year fluctuations. And you can also see that not only is there spatial variation, but it changes over time, right? So in these early years, southern Malawi has really high uncertainty. By 2010, it's shifted to being medium uncertainty, and by the most recent survey round, southern Malawi actually had become a place with relatively low uncertainty. It was actually kind of universally bad then. There was really drought, sort of consistent drought year after year in that period. But you can see that there's temporal variation and spatial variation in these uncertainty measures. And so we're coming at this 2 ways. So for our birth data, we're looking at using multi-level Poissons, and we're really thinking about adding in a random intercept for the survey cluster. So Catherine is a spatial demographer, and we're using this to sort of capture, one way of capturing some of that space-based and place-based variation. So rather than using a fixed effects model to sort of parameterize away some of that variation, we're kind of leaning into that place-based sort of variation in fertility that's there. And then we're also using multi-level logit models to look at modern contraceptive use. When we think about our fertility results, so our first model is just looking at this sort of more traditional measure of drought or non-drought, and we find this marginally significant association so that in the year after a drought, women had marginally lower fertility than when they were in sort of an average rainfall year. And we find that when we add in our measure of uncertainty, that effect on drought strengthens. So in a drought year, fertility, the total fertility rate in the country would be around a little bit less than 4% lower relative to the TFR in sort of an average rainfall year. But we don't see any significant effects for either the severe drought categories or for the above average categories. What we do see, however, is this sort of significant effects around rainfall uncertainty. So in clusters that have high levels of uncertainty, we actually see significantly lower fertility rates. And in the clusters that we have low levels of uncertainty, we have significantly higher fertility rates. If we were comparing places that have low versus high uncertainty, you would expect in the high uncertainty categories, the TFRs to be about 10% lower than they are in moments of low uncertainty for clusters. So it actually ends up being a fairly substantial change in fertility rates that are there. The difference between models 2 and 3, we've been thinking, I think, very parsimoniously from a spatial perspective, and have been kind of reluctant to add in sort of more individual level characteristics. But in model 3, we add in a control for education, and it really doesn't make much difference, except it really weakens the association that we're seeing for low uncertainty that's there. And so that's something we're in the process of starting to think about what might be going on with this. So when we're thinking, and then when we shift on to thinking about contraceptive use, we find really similar results that actually in some ways are strengthened and in other ways are weakened in ways that we're puzzling through right now. So we get much stronger effects for these year-to-year rainfall shocks that are happening. So again, we still see the strongest effect happening, the largest change in fertility happening in following a drought year. There's also slightly higher fertility than average in a severe drought year, but substantially lower than what we see in a drought year. And we also then see in this extremely high above average rainfall, we actually see significantly lower modern contraceptive use rates in that moment as well. So you're sort of seeing it's consistent with what we see, but a much stronger effect. This is actually consistent with some of the other literature that's looked at sort of the Alum and Portner and Sellers and Gray's work on droughts and sort of crop shocks and things like this also find stronger effects for contraceptive use than they do for actual birth outcomes. Whereas we were surprised to see that we actually have a weaker association between rainfall uncertainty and modern contraceptive use. So we still see that modern contraceptive use is higher in high uncertain places, which is consistent with what we were finding for births, but the effects aren't nearly as large or as significant, which is surprising given the fact that we have 1.3 million person months of observations to be looking at. So we're in the process of these are sort of hot off our data presses last week. So we're sort of thinking our way through this. The things that we're really interested in with our data is trying to really understand some of this on the nonlinear associations with our rainfall shock. So why is it that a drought year has a stronger impact on fertility than a severe drought year? And that sort of shows up consistently across our contraceptive use and our fertility outcomes. The thing that we've been thinking about this with is whether we could go in two different interpretations that the DHS isn't really set up to help us navigate between. So one potential explanation might be that sort of just the affordability and access to family planning clinics might get worse in a severe drought year. So if the household economy has really substantially been hit, you've had a really major failure of your harvest, you just might not be able to afford the transportation to get to the clinic in order to get access to family planning. And so that would both explain that weaker contraceptive use sort of impact, and it might also sort of explain the absence of a fertility change. The other interpretation would sort of lean in the direction of Sellers and Gray and sort of the traditional mean pain frameworks, where you think about that maybe in a severe drought, families might be returning and looking to fertility as a way of hedging against those future economic shocks. And we really don't have a way of thinking, of really sort of knowing what families are thinking in this process just from the data that we're using here. We're also really interested in exploring these mechanisms of uncertainty, particularly how we would have a stronger effect of uncertainty on fertility, but not on contraceptive use. And so if uncertainty is operating through something that's not happening to contraceptive use, it leaves that question of what that might be. One of our hypotheses we have right now is that places that are sort of more uncertain in their rainfall might have higher out-migration patterns. So if men are migrating in search of work when times are really uncertain, that would lead to spousal separations and could be suppressing it independent of contraceptive use. And so that's something we're in the process of thinking through. And then the next step we want to do quantitatively is just thinking about more heterogeneous responses to uncertainty. In the drought fertility literature, Herskovitz and her big study of 29 countries has found that sort of more educated individuals are more responsive to droughts than less educated individuals across the pool of sub-Saharan African countries. So the idea that people may both have a better sort of understanding of the role of contraception and family planning as a means of responding to hard times, and then also sort of how education opening up other access to other resources that can facilitate those choices as well. So I think you said I can go until 12:45, so I have time to talk about my qualitative part of my project too, which I was hoping. So we, at the same time that we were starting our quantitative analyses, we always from the beginning wanted this to be a mixed methods project. We knew there were lots of questions that we couldn't answer just with demographic and health survey or just survey data in general. And we really want to think about how were men and women on the ground in Malawi thinking about their rainfall environments as something that might be influencing their fertility preferences. And so we submitted our application for a grant in January. And then in March, Cyclone Idai hit Malawi. So jogging your memory, Cyclone Idai was sort of a hurricane cyclone that came, I guess it came this way, off the Indian Ocean, landed and devastated Beira, the port city in Mozambique. It was in the news, basically the entire city of Beira was leveled. And then it continued inland and ended up in Malawi. The area of Malawi that I've been working in since 2007 actually was one of the 2 districts in the country that was hardest hit by the rainfall when it came through. And so all of a sudden our grant that we had put in to think about how are people thinking about rainfall became a project that we were collecting in July about what happened in the immediate aftermath of Cyclone Idai. So we collected, Catherine and I collected 66 qualitative interviews in July. So from 2007 to 2013, Barbara Mensch and I and some other collaborators had a longitudinal survey of adolescents. We followed them until they were 20 to 23. And so one of our other sort of projects we've been thinking is trying to revisit our cohort now that they're in sort of peak adulthood, I guess if you could think. So our respondents from that longitudinal survey are now 25 to 29 years old. And so I wanted to use my qualitative interviews to both answer my substantive questions about how people were thinking about rainfall, but I was also interested in just using it as a proof of concept that I could find my original respondents. So we took a purposive sampling approach. So we started off with the people that we interviewed back in 2013, and then we intentionally chose clusters within the survey that we knew or expected to have been harder hit by the cyclone when it came through. And then we had a quota system of interviewing 3 men and 3 women within each cluster when we went there. So it was purely a convenient sample of who was still living in the area. We actually were able to find every single person that we tried to find. We at least, even if we didn't find them, we found someone who told us where they had migrated to. And so we were really happy with the consistency of our sample after so much time. So think of this as like a very purposive sample that was setting out really to sort of sampling on rainfall exposure of this group of people who were all 25 to 29 years old who had previously participated in my longitudinal survey. And some of the things that we found were sort of things, some we expected, some we didn't expect. Almost all of our respondents reported crop loss. So we're working in a very rural area of Malawi. We intentionally did not go to anybody living in towns. There were some very small like market centers, but that was the extent of it. And so anyone who was farming lost crops. We also found that more than 50% of our respondents either had their house collapse or they had some type of substantial structural damage. So that's not something that often gets picked up when people survey around shocks. Housing integrity is not something that often gets picked up alongside crop loss. So in Malawi, most houses are either mud constructed, and if you build a mud house, when it gets fully water saturated again, it basically just crumbles underneath of you. And so our respondents had all these narratives about how they noticed in the morning that there was the crack and they decided to get out and move to their brother's house. And by that afternoon, the whole house had given way. This is a photograph we took in the field this summer where it was a brick house, but again, they were using the local mud as the mortar between the bricks. And so when the mud mortar got fully saturated, even though it was a brick house, the winds coupled with the rain just made the whole house just collapse In this case, the respondent has now moved into her kitchen back here. So a lot of people were not, the thing that I think was also important about our field site is that even though there was lots of damage, very few people were physically displaced elsewhere. So people were really adapting in place. They were either moving into like the outer houses that they had in their compounds, or we had one respondent talked about how he moved into his brother's boys' hut, sort of just over the way. And so working with their local family networks to sort of fill into some of these sort of more provisional, less comfortable spaces while they were trying to make do. The thing that really surprised us, though, was that 85% of our respondents reported using modern contraception. Almost all of them reported either using injectables or using implants like Norplant. I was really skeptical of this in the field. This is rural Malawi. That sort of in Malawi, people still think of rural areas as having 6 children. The fertility decline is not really being underway. And so we put a lot of attention into trying to validate this numbers. Largely, I had my interviewers were asking a lot of really in-depth questions about how do you access contraception, where did you go, when did you get your last depot shot? And I think that the level of detail was strong enough that we believe that these numbers are real. Also, if you look to the 2015 DHS from Malawi, 25 to 29-year-old women, about 62% of them were already using modern contraception. So a jump from 62% in normal times to 85% in crisis situations, I think is a plausible increase in fertility or in modern contraceptive use. So I'm going to focus today just on giving you a couple of our results focused on these postponement narratives that came out of our interview. So we're still actively in the process of coding them, but I think some of our postponement stories come out pretty clearly. So in this case, it was a woman who was 20, all of our respondents are 25 to 29. She had 2 children, ages 10 and 8. And she talks about, she was being asked about sort of how, whether or not, after a series of questions, asked whether the big rainfall that had come through had changed her way of thinking about fertility. And she says, yes, I changed my mind. Now it's not the right time to get pregnant because there's a famine. Now I'm still waiting, but next year I'll have one. So a pregnant woman can't work to find food for her children, so she has to wait. Maybe in the future she can have one. I want to get prepared so that I should be able to take care of all the children. So things to think about, right? Her youngest child is 8. She actually wants to have 4 children, as she said. So she already has an 8 years have elapsed since her second birth, but she's still planning to have 4 children over her lifetime. And she's reflecting that, yes, I'm waiting, and that I was thinking about having a child this year. The rains came. I've immediately postponed it until next year, and grounding it in sort of the nutritional demands on a pregnant woman. So how much this large sort of economic shock on the household and the loss of food for the family is sort of immediately feeding into this choice. And also that flexibility that she's already waited 8 years. She's going to push it off for another year during these hard times. This is a father who had 3 children already, and he and the interviewer have been bantering about his fertility preferences, and he really, really wants to have a 4th child. But he's, again, in this space of being really flexible to it and what the timing is. And so the interviewer asked him about whether or not these recent rains had influenced his choice. And he says, yes, I changed my mind. And that's why I'm saying that I'll have another child after some years. This is 2019. I think the year to have another child is 2025, right? So right now his youngest child is 3, right? And so he already wants to wait another 6 years to be certain that things are going to be better. This idea that not everyone trusted that next year rains will be better, that maybe even if next year rains are better, there might be another catastrophe the year after that. And that's not a space for sort of preparing for children. And so this idea of 6 years is a good timeline to really be able to judge, are we secure or are we not secure? And then the next respondent kind of elaborates on this a little bit. This is a father with 2 children who says sort of very similarly, because of the circumstances, I saw that it would not be okay to have 3 children. So as of now, my wife and I, we've agreed to stop at having 2 children only. But when he says stop, he means pause. He doesn't mean stop, stopping behavior. And it goes on in the interview where the respondent jokes with him about having a 3rd child. And he says, yeah, I still think of it. It's still something that I'd like to do. And then he goes on to say that we have to get prepared. When you see that things are not okay, you wait for some time because things are not working properly. If all is well, it's very okay to have the 3rd child. it depends, right? This flexibility of that postponement choice is coming out again and again in these respondents' narratives. And so thinking around particularly that it's often, some people have this willingness to sort of on a year-to-year basis, particularly people who are already at that 8-year time birth interval that's there, whereas people with younger children are actually sort of thinking of even longer postponement horizons. Some of them had already been thinking of postponing births another few years beyond this, so when we caught them, the median desired birth interval that respondents gave was 5 years at the time of this, but it was 5 years from the survey, not 5 years from their most recent birth. And so if you factor the most recent birth in, it was somewhere between 6 and 8 years that most people were hoping to wait for that birth of that third or that fourth child to be coming in. And that in this space that you have this negotiability of that postponement time based upon sort of how circumstances are unfolding. So the concluding thoughts I have around this, the data really, I think, sort of point towards this increasing birth intervals and how fertility preferences really are flexible to these changing conditions. So if you're hoping to wait 5 years for your next birth, waiting 6 or 7 or 8 sort of fits within that framework and really kind of waiting. So people aren't necessarily disrupted by their weather shocks when you have these long intervals, but it also allows people to be a little bit more certain of their conditions by riding out some of these hard times, right? So this postponement is becoming really a flexible mechanism for dealing with things like weather shocks and more generally uncertain times. Another thing that I keep going back to and thinking about is family planning support during sort of both post-crisis situations, but even more generally thinking about what's going on with sort of their individual weather shocks that we were looking at. So one of the things that happened when the cyclone hit Beira is that Malawi's shipment of injectable contraceptions was on a container ship in Beira port. The original reports in the newspaper said that the boat sank. It actually turned out it didn't sink. It was just stuck in the harbor and nobody could get to it. And so it meant that there was a delay in getting the new shipment of contraception into the country. So we actually have at least 2 of our respondents who are talking about using injectable contraceptions. And when we asked them, when did you get your last injection? They said they were talking about their history. And so the interviewers were saying, like, when's the last time you got your shot? And a respondent was giving her history, and she should have gotten her shot in June, but she said that she got her most recent shot in July because when she went to the clinics in June, they were completely out. The stock of the country had run out because of this shipment that had gotten trapped in the port city. It eventually made its way to Malawi 2 or 3 months late, and so people did get access. And so there is this question that in this, every single respondent, well, all but 2 of our respondents thought that people should be postponing childbearing now. But in this case where there's widespread desire to postpone childbearing, but you have this crisis-induced inability to access contraception. It'll be really, it's the perfect natural experiment that's going to come out when the DHS gets collected next year, basically, to think about what's going on. It also makes me think a lot about what's happening during the severe drought periods where you have that lower contraceptive use and how much it's dependent upon individuals' ability to get to the clinics and afford that travel. And these data are going back. The most recent DHS was in 2015 to 16. One of the changes that the country has put in place since then, so since 2009, they've been gradually ramping up their national family planning program. And one of the things that some of the respondents talked about that I was unaware was happening now very recently is that the family planning clinics once a month will send a van out village to village and collect women. And so they'll tell the chief in advance we're coming, so people who are here, if it's their time to get their depot shot, gather up all the women in the village and we will take them to the clinic to go get their shots together. And so there are efforts to try to reduce some of that individual cost. So people who couldn't afford a bicycle taxi to get into where the clinics are, that barrier at least is starting to be removed in the country. And so moving forward, it'll be interesting to see as that is sort of a more flexible response to family planning during these crisis times. So with that, I think we're at exactly 12:45, and I thank you for your attention, and I'm looking forward to your questions.